out of my head! I already told you! I will not be distracted from this anymore! I won't! It will take more than head games to stop me! You may have invaded my mind and my body, but there's one thing a Saiyan always keeps! His pride!
Hi guys, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So I decided today to do a tutorial on functional movement screening. So functional movement screening was a topic that was discussed in one of our pracs at Varsity at NMU in the Nelson Mandela University, and I decided to use my YouTube platform or my YouTube channel to basically formulate a tutorial, or to give you guys a tutorial on what FMS basically is. So what is FMS? FMS stands for functional movement screen or functional movement screening. So the functional movement screen is basically a screening tool that is used to evaluate 7 fundamental movement patterns in individuals with no present pain complaint or musculoskeletal injury. So FMS is really a foundational, it's a tool to basically establish and evaluate your foundation of movement. Okay, and it is important to take into account that FMS is not intended to diagnose orthopedic problems. So the 7 fundamental movement patterns that would be assessed during your functional movement screen includes deep squats, the hurdle step, an inline lunge or inline lunges, shoulder mobility, active leg raises, trunk stability push-up, and the rotary stability test. Okay guys, so for the deep squat you would basically need a dowel, or what I used in my case just to improvise a bit was a broomstick. So firstly you would need to basically put the dowel on your head and then position your hands so that your arms form a 90-degree angle. After you've established a 90-degree angle, you would then basically extend your arms upwards, and when you get into the squat position, your feet should be shoulder width apart at the same time while holding the dowel extended above your head. Then you will go down for a deep squat. You will have 3 attempts, but yeah, in this video I just basically showed you how the movement should be executed. So you'll go down for your squat, and then what is important is that your femur and your shin bone should be parallel to, or your torso should be parallel to your shin bone, and your femur should be below your knee. Also, what is important is that your feet or your heels should not be elevated. They should be flat on the floor. And then obviously in my case, if your broomstick or your dowel stays above your head, then it is still efficient. But in my case, I managed to retract my scapula back quite a bit, as well as my elbows. Reason being is, this might look a bit weird as well, but I'm a bit double jointed, so that's why I'm able to, pull back the dowel so far back with my arms. But yeah, keeping the dowel above your head in this position is fine. And yeah, then we'll move on to how this screen or this movement would be scored. So if you manage to position yourself in this form or in this specific position, you would be given a score of 3. That is if you attended to the characteristics that I specified earlier. A score of 2 would be given if your heels are elevated from the back. So in the case where a patient or an athlete or an individual's heels are elevated slightly, you can assist them by putting a weight plate below their feet or below their heels, or you, like what I had to do is I kind of had to improvise because I didn't have the whole hurdle step kit. So I basically used a small plank to elevate a patient's or a client's heels if they were found to be elevated. And then also for a score of 2 to be given, the femur still needs to be below the knee and the torso parallel to the shin bone. So a score of 1 would be given if the heels are lifted or elevated from the floor, and at the same time your femur is not below the knee, and clearly in this case the torso is not parallel with the shin bone. And another thing to take into account is the fact that the position of the dowel is like the person is quite leaning forward, so the dowel isn't held above the person's head. So yeah, in this case you would give him a 1, and in the case where any pain is associated, a score of 0 would be given. Okay, so the next screening test that I demonstrated is the hurdle step. So what you will do is you will basically have to kind of use a hurdle step or improvise and kind of construct your own hurdle step. So as you've seen, in this case, I've positioned the dowel on my shoulders, like kind of mimicking the position a ball would be if I was to go down for a squat. And what you basically need to do is you need to step over the hurdle and then use your heel to touch the floor. And once you've touched the floor, while maintaining your leg or your foot over the hurdle, you would then lift your leg back up and return to the starting position, focusing on not touching the hurdle or knocking the hurdle over. And like, for example, in this case, we would see if there is proper alignment of the knee, the hip, and the spine. So here you can see the way of establishing that is looking at the dowel itself. So while I'm executing the movement, you will see that there is minimal forward and side or backward and sideways or lateral movement of the dowel, and my knees and my hips and my spine can then be identified as being aligned. So just to give a little bit clarity on the hurdle step that I made. So in practice, what you will do is, and what I did in this case, is you would measure the length of your tibia, or in simple terms, your shin bone, and then that should basically be the height of your hurdle. In my case, I had to improvise with like two boxes or containers, and then just use weights on each side just to make sure that my hurdle is at the height or the length of my tibia. So yeah, you don't always need the state-of-the-art equipment. If you improvise a bit, you should be fine. So in terms of scoring the hurdle step test, so a score of 3 would be given if, for example, in this case, as I've demonstrated, your knees, your hips, and your spine is in proper alignment with minimal lateral or front and backwards shifting of your dowel. So this will also give an indication of how tight your hip flexors are and how strong your gluteal muscles are in order to maintain the stability during the movement. A score of 2 will be given if clearly, as you can see in this example, the knee, the hips, and the spine aren't in alignment with one another, and there is also a shifting of the dowel at the top. So in this case, you would give the individual a score of 2. And then obviously a score of 1 would be given if the individual is unable to step over the hurdle while maintaining proper form, or if the hurdle gets knocked over. Again, if any pain is associated with the movement, a score of 0 would be given. So the next movement pattern that I demonstrated would be the inline lunge. So with the inline lunge, you would want an overhand grip at the top of the dowel and an underhand grip at the bottom of the dowel. When you go down for your lunge, you have to maintain posture. In other words, keep the dowel parallel to your spine and parallel to the back. And the dowel should also maintain contact with your back and with the back of your head when you go down. Important point also is when you go down for your lunge, your knee at the top should not extend over the toe of the foot that you put in front, and the knee that goes down shouldn't extend beyond the platform that you're doing the lunge on. Then in terms of scoring, so in this case, with the demonstration I gave, I would have been scored a 2. Why? Because the dowel isn't held completely parallel with my spine, and my head should also be positioned straight and a little bit backward, so that the back of my head still touches the dowel. So if I managed to achieve that, I would have been given a 3. Also, a score of 2 is given if the patient is unable to maintain a body posture, clearly has difficulty with keeping the body upright and extending the knee beyond the platform. And then a score of 1 would be given if balance is lost completely and it is clear that the individual cannot at all perform the movement. A score of 0 would be given if any pain is associated with the movement. So the next thing that will be assessed is your shoulder mobility. There's not much to explain to this video. We've all done the stretch, we've all done the pose. It is also known as the cow face pose. But yeah, clearly I have poor mobility in my shoulders. So how you would measure this is you would basically take a measuring tape and then measure from the top hand to the bottom hand what the distance is, and then you would do your scoring accordingly. So just to demonstrate to you guys what an example of exceptional shoulder mobility or shoulder flexibility is, I used the example of the FMS test that I did on my girlfriend, Delita. Clearly, you can see that she has exceptional shoulder flexibility and mobility because there's no gap between her hands. And what also should be taken into consideration is the fact that her posterior chain muscles are really well developed. You can see the protruding or the superficial trapezius muscles and the other muscles of the posterior chain that are quite obvious and that you can see are well developed. Normally, with someone that has good developed musculature, they don't have much flexibility, but in this case, obviously, she has flexibility as well, which even solidifies the mobility and the flexibility of the shoulders even more. And then just to show on the other side that she also would be scored a 3 given the same extent of flexibility and mobility. And then just for the purpose of clarification, a score of 3 would be given if the gap between the hands is less than the length of one hand length. A score of 2 would be given if the gap between the hands are less than 1.5 hand lengths, but more than one hand length. And a score of 1 would obviously be given if the gap between the hands are more than 1.5 or half hand lengths. Following this, you would have your client performing an active leg raise. So what you want to do is you want to basically establish a reference point, and your reference point can be, for example, what I used here was a 114 by 38. It's a normal plank, and your knee. So your knee should be resting on the reference point, and so in this case the 114 by 38, the edge of it was just on the superior portion of my calf, and in that case my knee was able to rest on the plank. What you would then do is you would just simply lift up your leg as far as possible, and then that would be assessed accordingly. So in terms of scoring, you would look at the extent of the leg raise. So in this case, my legs were raised past the point of being perpendicular to the floor, so that would obviously be given a score of 3. Then what you can do is you can use your broomstick and basically hold it upright at the level of the opposite femur, but perpendicular to the ground or to the floor. And then when you lift your leg or raise your leg up, you would be able to establish the extent or the mobility by, for example, if it's given a score of 2, your femur of the lifted leg will be past the point of the broomstick, or you can also use a dowel. But clearly, as you can see, the client in this case was unable to lift the tibia past the point of the broomstick or the dowel. So a score of 1 would be given if the client is unable to lift the tibia, the knee and the femur past the level or the point of the dowel or broomstick or whatever you're using. So the following test that I demonstrated was the trunk stability push-up. So a push-up is easy and, or not easy, it's a simple movement, but in this case your feet will be held together and your hands would be at the level of your ears, and then you would simply apply pressure by the hands to the floor and you would push upwards to get into your push-up position. When scoring the movement pattern, you would be looking at the holistic alignment of the body. So the alignment of the hips, the back, the shoulders, and the knees, and basically how they are aligned with one another. Obviously, this would be given a score of 3 because it displays good alignment and there is no like lag or tipping of the torso or the lower back. So I know this looks pretty much like the previous picture, but in this case you'd see the back is a bit arched. In other words, the lower back dips a little bit. So even with the slightest misalignment in terms of the relationship between the spine, the hips and the knee, then it will be either be given a 2 or 1. So a score of 1 would be given if the client is able to lift the upper portion of the body up, but not the rest of the body. So as displayed on the picture, then a score of 1 would be given. Okay, so for the rotary stability test, in all honesty, I was unable to perform the test myself. I simply don't have the stability for it, but what I did do was I did include another YouTube video to show how it is done.
Get on your hands and knees over the board, so your hands are under your shoulders, and your knees are under your hips. The thumbs, knees, and toes must contact the sides of the board, and the toes must be pulled toward the shins. Simultaneously shift and lift your right hand forward, and your right leg backward at the same time, like you are forming a straight line. Then without touching down, touch your right elbow to your right knee directly over the board. Re-extend the arm and leg over the board. Then return to the starting position. Perform 3 repetitions on both sides and score the best repetition. If this movement is too difficult, perform the movement with the following diagonal pattern. Simultaneously lift your right hand forward and the left leg backward at the same time. Then without touching down, touch your right elbow to your left knee directly over the board. Re-extend your arm and leg, then return to the starting position. Perform 3 repetitions on both sides and score the best repetition. Scoring the rotary stability. You score a 3 if you perform a correct unilateral repetition. Unilateral limbs remain over the board. Without touching down, touch the same side elbow to the same side knee over the board. You score a 2 if you perform a correct diagonal repetition. The diagonal knee and elbow meet over the board. Without touching down, touch the opposite elbow and knee over the board. You score a 1 if you are unable to perform a diagonal repetition.
So that brings me to the end of my tutorial. Guys, please like my video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.
This night is cold in the kingdom. I can feel you fade away. From the kitchen to the bathroom sinking. Your steps keep me awake. Don't cut me down, throw me out, leave me here to waste. I once was